I am very delighted to be able to introduce Monica Izar, Global Head of Endowments and Foundation for J.P. Morgan Global Asset Management, to come to the stage. And I just want to call out our thanks again to J.P. Morgan Chase, and to note, for those of you who are still excited about going to that annual report that we talked about earlier today, they are one of the foundations that we have highlighted in our annual report. So please join me in welcoming Monica. Thank you.
Thanks, Rana. Thanks, Rana, and thank you to all of you here. A very big welcome to the members of the Philanthropy New York group and all the viewers online streaming, as I understand it, they're doing right about now. As global head of the Endowments and Foundations Group, I'm very privileged to be able to work with endowments and foundations all around the world that help create, sustain the fabric of the cities that we all work in. When I think about, likewise, J.P. Morgan very much believes that we, as a firm, have the responsibility to serve these clients by delivering investment advice, as well as developing relationships in cities all around the world. J.P. Morgan's corporate foundation, as Rana mentioned, contributes more than $200 million every single year in organizations that create pathways to prosperity by providing workforce training. A number of you have heard about the work that we've been doing on creating affordable housing, as well as helping small business prosper all around the world. In addition to the financial contributions, one of the things that I, as a 20-year veteran of J.P. Morgan, is really proud of is our employees and the time that they spend. Over 560,000 hours of volunteer service globally, with more than 16,000 of those hours, guess where? In New York City. It's just remarkable. And I'm going to pass it over to Rana, who's then going to introduce our amazing speakers.
You're in the middle, I suppose.
We round-tripped you.
Just checking out the room. Thank you so much, and thank J.P. Morgan Chase again for hosting us today. I want to thank all of you for being here with us today for what is going to be an amazing next panel. And as well, we want to welcome the folks who are just now joining us online. So, we have a great panel that I can see just lined up, ready to roll right over there. The conversation is going to be between Jana, Liason, Gabelli, and Kristof. It's going to run for just about an hour. And because we have only an hour, we're not going to actually do an audience Q&A, but hopefully the folks are going to hang around during our reception so you can go and talk to them with your questions then. I'm going to introduce each of our guests and ask them to come on stage as I do. Then we've asked Deputy Secretary General Liason to start us off with a couple of remarks. He is going to be followed by Ms. Gabelli, who will say a few words, and then we will have a wonderful conversation moderated by Mr. Kristof. So first, please welcome Jana Liason, Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations. Jana Liason became Deputy Secretary General in July of 2012. Ambassador Liason was, from 2007 to 2008, the Special Envoy of the UN Secretary General. Prior to that, Jana Liason served as the President of the 60th session of the UN General Assembly. He has a diplomatic career that is very impressive, as I am looking at it right here. So please do make sure that you read his bio in your program. Mr. Liason was the first UN Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and was involved in operations in Africa and the Balkans. He's taken initiatives on landmine, conflict prevention, and humanitarian action. So welcome. Next, please welcome Lema Gabelli, President of the Gabelli Peace Foundation Africa and the 2011 Nobel Peace Laureate. Welcome. Lema Gabawi is a Liberian peace activist, trained social worker, and women's rights advocate. She was the founding head of the Liberian Reconciliation Initiative and was the co-founder and former executive director of Women, Peace and Security Network Africa. Lema is currently named a Distinguished Fellow in Social Justice at Barnard College. She travels internationally to advocate for human rights and peace and security. Lema's leadership of the Women of Liberia Mass Action for Peace, which brought together Christian and Muslim women in a nonviolent movement, played a pivotal role in ending Liberia's civil war in 2003, and it is chronicled in her memoir, Mighty Be Our Powers, and in the award-winning documentary, Pray the Devil Back to Hell. And finally, please welcome Nick Kristof, a columnist for the New York Times. Mr. Kristof is a two-time Pulitzer Prize winner. He has lived on 4 continents, reported on 6, and traveled to more than 150 countries, plus all 50 states, every Chinese province, and every main Japanese island. That is very impressive. After joining the New York Times in 1984 and initially covering economics, he served as a Times correspondent in Los Angeles, Hong Kong, Beijing, and Tokyo. He's also covered presidential politics and is the author of the chapter on President George W. Bush in the book, The Presidents. He later became the associate managing editor of the Times for Sunday editions. In 1990, Mr. Kristof and his wife, Cheryl Wu Dun, also at that time a Times journalist, won a Pulitzer Prize for their coverage of China's Tiananmen Square democracy movement. They were the first married couple to win a Pulitzer for journalism. So I'm expecting this is going to be an amazing conversation, and I'm really looking forward to it. Deputy Secretary General Liason, will you please start us off?
Sure.
Wherever you want, there or here. It's your choice.
Well, I think I can see you better if I stand up, and you may see me better also. Anyway, great to be with you. Thanks for your kind introduction, a gentle reminder of my age. And you mentioned that I was the first emergency relief coordinator in the UN. I was dealing with Sudan and Somalia, some of the crises that I still deal with today. There was a reception when I left New York back in those days, in the 90s, and the lady who introduced me said some very nice things. But in the end, she put me back on earth again, because she said, now, ladies and gentlemen, let us meet, let us ask Mr. Liason to come up to the podium. He is having worked with disasters and emergencies, he is the man responsible for all disasters in the world. I thought that was somewhat unfair. But I just want to thank you very much for what you're doing and what you have done and hopefully what you will do. We live in a very troubled world in turmoil. We have problems both in the area of peace and security, development and human rights. And the 3 areas belong together. There is no peace without development. There is no development without peace. And none of the above without respect of human rights and the rule of law. These 3 pillars are the pillars for any decent society, any international order, the United Nations. And if one of these pillars is weak, the whole structure is weak. I saw that when I was Special Envoy in Darfur. You missed out the location. It was Darfur. That they are belonging together, and that weakness in one sector means weaknesses in others. Today we have huge challenges in the Middle East, in Africa. We will probably discuss those subjects under Nick Kristof's guidance. We have particularly, of course, the horror of Sudan, of Syria. And we have new crises that have erupted the last few months, like Yemen. What I'm dreaming of, sounds almost like I have a dream, but what I would hope very much is that we finally move in the direction of prevention. We absolutely now need to take measures to act early on. If I make this gesture and say this is the life of a conflict, it's a long line, it's a long distance between those 2 hands. But unfortunately, sometimes Security Council and CNN and others consider this is the life of a crisis. but they often see it as here, in the middle. We don't see that we have to do prevention, pre-crisis and post-conflict. If we do that better, we can save so much of lives, so much money, so much night sleep, good reputation of our organization. And there is so much more we can do if we pick up those early signals. For a conflict to erupt, for a development crisis to come from a drought that turns out to higher food prices for people who live on $1.50 a day, which means food riots and huge social economic problems, and also human rights violations. The first vibrations in the ground for human rights violations, that's what we need to listen to. Why do we wait for the mass atrocities to occur? That's why we now have a program which is called Human Rights Up Front, which is to serve as an early warning signal. We go to the Security Council and warn about conflicts that can get worse. We did it in late warning situations in Central African Republic, South Sudan. We did it, and I can say that openly now, we did it in the case of Nigeria, where there was a worst case scenario if these elections had gone wrong and the actions taken by the president who was voted out, if that he had not resigned, we could have had a horrible situation. We worked very much under the surface with the Nigerians to do prevention. So here we are in a world where we sometimes have a sense we walk over a minefield and losing control over the many areas where we need to be present and do our job. We have a huge humanitarian crisis. The biggest ever appeal for humanitarian assistance was done for Syria and the neighborhood in about 3 months ago. It was $8 billion, the biggest ever. But the problem of today's appeals is that when I was emergency relief coordinator, I got 60–70% of the money we asked for in the appeals. Now Valerie Amos, our outgoing USG Undersecretary General, and her replacement, which is Stephen O'Brien, they get in around between 25 and 30% of the appeals. And the needs are enormous, and we therefore, again, that's a reason to go in the direction of prevention, isn't it? And then we have, of course, the refugee crisis. 51 million refugees in the world, displaced and refugees. And, of course, the migration flows. You see the horrors in the Mediterranean and in Southeast Asia. We have growingly water crisis. We need to take into account that we are the first generation in history which have to think seriously about the survival of the planet. We may have plan B in life, don't we? But we certainly have no planet B. And here we are with this climate change development leading to enormously vehement floods and hurricanes and so forth, causing huge damage and enormous costs also. Water becomes scarce. We need to find methods not to fight about water, but rather share water. If we don't recognize that we are living in a day of scarcity of water, and we could either go the road of competing or fighting about it or cooperating about it, that's another challenge. And then, of course, children. The way the children fare in the world is just horrific in every respect. And there are so many programs that we need to carry out and so much work to do. So I just want to say to you that American philanthropy has done great things in your own history, the Rockefellers and the Carnegie. And, of course, the Rockefellers made sure that we had a house to move into here. The United Nations building was a donation from the Rockefeller family. Thank you very much. Anyone here from? Stephen, Stephen Heights is there. And I would like to see an export of the American tradition of giving, because there's so much money around in the world. And as I said to Nick Kristof before I came in, we can't do it alone. Nobody can do it alone. Nobody can do everything, but everybody can do something. And we recognize that if we are to face these problems effectively, then we have to do it together. These new sustainable development goals that we negotiate can never be done if we don't have the cooperation of the private sector, the philanthropic sector, the scientific community. Then we can get things done. And this horizontal approach is what we should adopt. We've been far too long stuck in the vertical, in the silos. We have to be good in the silos and verticals, but when we solve problems, we have to go horizontal. So we need you, and possibly you need us. And I'm very glad that I was asked to give this introduction, and then I will leave it to Lema, I suppose, and then Nick. Thank you.
Thank you. It's interesting that you all decided to stir up trouble by bringing the UN and an activist on the same panel. But I like him very much. I'm going to go very easy with him.
Thank you.
It is truly an honor to be here, and it's interesting that the DSG talked about the global crisis and the role of individuals and entities, and I would just like to look at the role of a particular group, women, in all of this. I have a theory that the world that we find ourselves in today is seen with one eye cover, meaning unless we move into using the unique roles and skills of women in everything that we try to do, we will continue to see these conflicts and crises come in, go back, come in, go back. A few weeks ago, I spent the last 1 year working with women from South Sudan since the war started in South Sudan. So we found ourselves in Nairobi the weekend of Mother's Day, and I was able to meet with some of the Muslim women who live in communities not far from the Somalian border. We're talking about the attacks on Kenya, regular attacks, and I was asking these women, you were able to do a lot during the Refugee Crisis in Kenya. What is it now that you all cannot find your feet? And the answer was simple. It's not that we cannot find our feet. Community and the government is not using our expertise. We know exactly where these boys are. We know where the guns are hidden. And no one is coming to ask us. And until they engage us, we can't find. A case was given where the government had taken on the services of some women to be a part of the community policing. They went into this community where all of the security apparatus had been in for months, and no one could identify where the guns were hidden and where the militants were hiding. And this woman said, whilst they were there, they went to do prayers. And the women obviously would pray by themselves. The older women said they wanted to have a private conversation with the community policing group. Went into conversation. He said, you see that mosque that has not been used for months? That's where all of the guns are hidden, and that's where the militants are. So this particular mosque had been shut down for public use, and there was some excuse were given to the community. And this woman who's part of the community policing said she went back, tipped off the police and the military, and they came in, and what they found would have been the next disaster for any university campus or any school in Kenya. I tell this story to say that many times in this world, not just, and now I hate to hear the excuse that women are better peace builders, better this because they are mothers, but they are very good analysts when it comes to the conflict and the conflict context. They know their community. In Liberia, the women told us, we knew when war was about to start, the number of young boys who were selling in our markets were more than usual. The sports activities that were not happening were more than usual. In Wajir, the women said we knew when there was going to be war because the animals were easily agitated because of the smell of gunpowder from far away. These are things that we can use to change communities, especially when it comes to issue of peace and security. When it comes to economic empowerment, women also have a role to play. Every time they talk about, oh, let's go to the World Economic Forum, let's go to this place, let's go to that place. I know of women in communities in Africa who have educated 10, 15 people at master's and PhD level just from little market stalls. Who's doing this, the analysis of what they're using to build these? And thank God we're standing in a JP Morgan building. How are they looking at these women? How can we build on these things to measure the impact on society and the economic growth, not just looking at it as these poor market women? I'm saying this because we're also in this room with a lot of philanthropists, people who want to do good by the world. Don't just go in for those who can read and write and speak all of the good language, because you know, one of the things that I know from dealing with some of you in this room is that you want to see the reports You want to see the neat proposals. You want to see the neat bank accounts. And you want to see the accountant sitting in office. You want to see all of these things. And you get them, but you don't get the real work. Several years ago, no one would recognize us as a group worthy of their dollar when we started activism in Liberia. No one, because we're a group of pathetic-looking women. That's how some of the donors mentioned us in their interviews. We're a group of pathetic-looking women who could get nothing done. But history has proven that these pathetic-looking women actually went out there without any political stake, and they got the job done. It's important for us to recognize that. But beyond that recognition, we need to also see that women's growth and development globally is under attack. Garissa in Kenya, where you had the university attack a few months ago, communities spent years begging the government to bring a university into that community. After that attack, the university is shut down. There seems to be no hope because all of the professors are saying we don't want to go into a place where we're not safe. People don't want those who came from outside to school. But this is one community where you will not find a school, not just for boys, but also for girls. Nigeria, Boko Haram, and the constant attack on girls. These are things that we need to look into, work on, and see how we can use the unique skills of women to bring back some of these things that we're fighting to do. If you continue to look or continue to deal with the work with the one eye cover, all of you will retire and you probably will not see any impact. So I urge you and encourage you to not just look at those who have the bank accounts and the fancy offices when you go into communities to work, but start looking at the women and look at some of the skills that they bring. Regardless how their physical appearance look, they may have something unique to contribute. Thank you.
Bravo to both of you. Lema holds up not half the sky, but about 80% of the sky, I think. Let me, though, start with you, Jan. You talked about conflicts, and one looks around the world, Syria, South Sudan, Central African Republic, Eastern Congo, and I think there is sort of a question about what role philanthropy can play in these efforts. I mean, I remember one point in Central African Republic coming across this beautiful clinic built by charity, and of course in the absence of any kind of peacekeeping, it had been, the nurses had been driven away, all the equipment stolen, and it's not obvious right now in Syria or in South Sudan what role philanthropy can play in as you say, there's no development without peace, but so what is the role of philanthropy there?
Well, I just simply find that we can't do it alone. We need the resources, we need the competence, we need the advice that can be given, and I think that we need to work out better cooperation patterns between the NGOs, UN agencies, and philanthropic organizations. Find different combinations. We will have much more leverage if we do it together. I can give you an example of how much it means to go horizontal. We had these horrors of the migration across the Mediterranean and in Southeast Asia. If Antonio Guterres at UNHCR had acted alone, or Bill Swing of IOM, International Migration Act alone, it wouldn't have worked. But we had a mobilization of efforts of practically all the actors on the migration area and brought them together, and we really had an impact. We heard from the European Union, in particular, that our common stand that we had been taking had been extremely important. So I think we need to work together both on the policy level, on the headquarters level, but also more and more out there in the field. We are trying very hard, and you hinted very much that we need to reform the United Nations. I think you sent the message here, didn't you, Lema? But I say that we can only do it if we work horizontally and bring together not only the UN family, but also philanthropic organizations. And this goes not only for money, but also for talents and ideas, and reaching out to your own community. You are as important out there in the field as you are to US Congress and to the public life and to Nick Kristof when he writes articles. So I just feel that we almost feel desperate about seeing 25% of the appeal. I was in Lebanon when the World Food Programme was cutting down the rations of the food because they simply didn't have money to do the job. That's when I feel that we got to reach out and make sure we work together.
What about philanthropy playing a role as kind of a watchdog over the UN, over the agencies? I mean, I wonder if sometimes the UN isn't, if you will, too diplomatic. And one role that private groups can be is being very undiplomatic and applying pressure.
No, I think we got to be very honest. And above all, I think we have to listen to the people on the ground. I mean, as Lema said, we have to go as close as possible to the grassroots. I always carry the UN Charter in the pocket. This is my 12th version since 1980. And I want to remind you of the first 3 words of this charter. It's we the peoples. We the people. We're here to serve the peoples. And that's why the deeper you go to the needs, when it comes to peace, to development, or human rights, that's where you belong. And I think also then we have to be very transparent and very open. You know, sometimes some of the ideas are not good at all. And we should discuss that openly. Sometimes I've seen examples of counterproductive ideas and projects. But we need to discuss that between us, but also with those who are, of course, in the end affected.
Lema, you made the point about philanthropists kind of sometimes missing some of the organizations that can be most effective on the ground. But what is philanthropy supposed to do? In other words, do you think the emphasis on metrics, on scalability, is misplaced?
Totally. I want to be very honest, totally. You know, metrics and all of these things do not stop the rapes in the community. They are not the ones that help the girl child to go to school. They are not the ones doing mentorship. You obviously need all of those things. But if you make that the basis on which or the foundation on which your work is built, you get the people who can do it. If you go to Totota in Baue County, Totota is the best example, according to the UN, and every other agency that have been there, of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 in action. In 2005, when we ended the mass action, and I was leaving, one of our legacy projects was to build peace huts in every community. It was a memorial to those communities that women had protested in these communities. It was also a space for women to talk about the issues in their community, and it was a space to mobilize the next generation of women leaders. Totota is the unique example of that work in progress. Everyone that I know have been to that space to see those women in action. This is the place where if there's a rape in the community, these women have a task force of women. They go to the alleged perpetrator and bring him to the peace hut first. Ask him questions. If they are clear that he is the perpetrator, turn him over to the police. Then the police process him for court. But once it's in the government hands, they have nothing to do with it. But they've never been to school. If you ask them for metrics and all of these things, or if that is the basis for the work that you do with them, they would never give it to you. And on that basis, you would just discount them and they may never work. Let me say one thing, and I'm going to say it very clearly here. Philanthropists come into spaces and they're very excited about helping community people, good intentions. As soon as they come into countries, after 1, 2, 3 months, interaction with governments, the only focus is interacting with governments. So everyone wants to be at the president's dinner. They put it in their annual report. Everyone wants to be at this thing. They want to be at that thing. In as much as and I'm going to shoot myself in the foot here because we have some of the biggest people in this room. But sometimes it's just like, just do your work with whatever little you can get, and just don't worry about these people. Because if they are coming into the country and it's always about governments, you may never get them to do what you want them to do. So like he said, let's be realistic here. Sometimes you come, you have good ideas, but those are not the ideas that will work for the community. You need to talk to the people. And what I have seen as an activist and a practitioner, if you come to the ground where people are desperate and you tell them, oh, you need this, you need this, you need this, they will go along with you because they are desperate and they're expecting to get something. Not many people will say no because there's desperation. If you come to the ground and say, what is it that we can do? How can we do this? Let me tell this story and shut up. A few years back, one community in Liberia, the women used to walk like 30 minutes to the river, 30 minutes back, up north. And this group came in. Good intentions. We want to build pump, a hand pump. No one asked anyone. They just put a pump in the middle of the community. 6 months later, another group went into that community to document the life and work of the women and realized that almost all of the women were alcoholics. What is the problem? Well, we suffer domestic violence. Our children have problems. Walking to the stream was our outlet.
Or escape.
You put the pump in the middle of the community. We don't do that anymore. Alcohol is our escape. Food for thought.
So, what is the solution? I mean, if I'm unlikely to come into $1 billion, but if I do, and I want to invest it in ways that are going to have the greatest impact, then people are going to, people swarm upon philanthropists with all kinds of good ideas. In the past, we made those kinds of mistakes precisely because we didn't have robust metrics, because we didn't have evaluations. So how do we decide? What criteria do we use?
Let me just say something. If just as organizations, small organizations have their fish and chips, if you got into $1 billion, I will be the first at your house telling Cheryl we need to have a conversation with you all. What is going to be your fish and chips? That's the problem. What do you want to work on? Not everything that is sexy. What we've seen a lot of philanthropists do is chase thematic concerns. They are not focused on one. Last year, everyone was focused on Ebola. And no one was thinking about post-Ebola. So let me just hold back some of the resources. After this thing go down, maybe, just maybe, I would need to go in there. Today, no one is thinking about it. So just as the conflict, a few weeks ago, Syria was hot on the news. Everyone wanted to give money to Syria. Today, they're struggling for money. The World Food Program cannot. So where do you want to find yourself? What do you want to do? Not chasing every other thing. Once you know where your focus is, you can go on the ground and do a solid assessment. Honestly, by talking to community people, you can know exactly which group is doing the work.
I have an additional idea to what you choose to do. One analysis that is worth doing is to ask, if I do this investment in this project in this area, what other side effects will you have? Ever since I saw kids die in front of me in diarrhea, dysentery, dehydration in Africa in the 90s, I felt the least I could do for these kids is to be always committed to the water issue, and I created Water Aid Sweden, part of the international organization. If you do water and sanitation right, I mean, you can make the case probably for the same women's empowerment and education, but just look at water. And then if you take the horizontal approach of doing water right, then you find on the present Millennium Development Goals, water is one of the number 7 there. If you do water and sanitation right, what do? You reduce drastically child mortality, number 4. You improve maternal health, number 5. You improve girls' education, number 3 or 2. Gender equality, number 3, or vice versa. And poverty. In other words, when you do this, you have enormously important side effects. That's why we have to get away from this silo approach. I would say that look at the area that you're aiming to support and ask what will come out of it. Where can I build alliances? Where do we reach the real results on the ground? And that is another way of looking at what
I guess
to
get those results, I would be wary of moving too much away from metrics. Let me give you the example of cook stoves. So here in the U.S., there was this tremendous excitement about clean cook stoves. They were going to make this tremendous difference on the ground, reduce indoor air pollution in Africa, in Asia, empower women so they no longer have to fetch firewood from long distances. And I mean, this kind of goes to what you were saying. Nobody really spent enough time talking to women themselves and seeing how they would work in villages. And when they were carefully studied in a randomized control trial, after $100 million had been pledged, it turned out that basically everybody loved them except the people who would actually use them. And maybe there will be new generations of clean cook stoves down the road, but it was only through really careful evaluation, in that case a randomized trial, that we really got a sense of what works. That gut instinct completely misled some really smart people who were completely focused on very important issues.
Nick, I think the problem is when you come into communities, and this is what I teach my students, please do not come thinking that we're dummies. Every community you go in, people have an idea of what it is that they want and how that change can come. The problem with most of the people coming into the spaces that they come into is they come with the savior mentality. We've come in to save these poor people, whether they're Africans or Arabs or whatever, we've come to save them. And once you go in with the savior mentality, $1 billion later, you will realize that you were the one who did not come thinking right. So it's always important to go in there and ask, what is it that we can do? How can we do this? Some of the students a few months ago presented projects to me. One of these little girls have raised so much money. How was she going to do her project? Mentorship by Skype. Are you kidding me? Where is the computer? Where is the internet access? And then when you wake up, the normal college student will wake up on a no school day at 10 a.m. It's 3 p.m. Those kids are looking for food to eat. Will you get them to sit? And I just look at her and say, girlfriend, that is so not going to work. Sorry for taking the wind out of your sail. Another group decided to do something where they would take kids from central Liberia to the U.S. Embassy in Monrovia to talk to young people. And so these young children are sitting and Skyping with them at the U.S. Embassy, and they're on the other side having breakfast. And they're looking at you, having your breakfast and talking to them. The project didn't go anywhere. If you want to do it right, go on the ground, ask questions. There are so many analyses. I say, tons of them. You go to the UN, you ask them for analysis, they will give it to you. You go to communities, they will give it to you. Just ask questions and questions and questions, and eventually you will get it right. There are some people who are getting it right, but there are others who are just doing it. And I finally think that there's a lot of feel-good in philanthropy nowadays. I'm sorry, but I just have to say the hard truth. Someone has gotten into some money, they feel bad about something, and then let me just go and give something to someone. I sit on a board where someone has amassed almost $75 billion. I'm happy that they've done that. And we're supposed to do something globally. And someone tell me, oh, let's consider this person because he gave $250,000 to a maternal health clinic in Africa. As the only African on that board, I said, don't insult me. Please don't. So I think we need to move away from feeling good, and I think people in this space can help others. If you came into this to feel good, please get away because you will be destroying everything that we have worked to build over the time.
This sort of goes to the same question. I mean, to what extent do you see philanthropy or efforts to help not empowering people, but disempowering people?
I think I'm the hardcore here, so let me let the DSG speak.
I'm just searching my mind for disempowering. I think if you do something out of the blues, which is not connected to the realities, then it's bound to fail. But I was just picking up from Lema. I was in a little village in Ethiopia about 3 years ago. I had asked what they did about youth unemployment in this town. And there was a group of 17-year-old people. They were actually gang members. But something had happened to the big and dominating guy in that group because he decided to start a new life. And he did it by cleaning toilets in that city. And he and his 5 colleagues, young friends, they did it so well that people were willing to pay a little sum to go into these wonderful toilets with water and soap and everything. It was smelling good, everything was fine. Now, this had turned out to be such a good idea that this had turned into he had 10, 15 people employed doing that in this city. So I asked him, what a brilliant idea. What is your main idea? What drives you? What is the idea? And then he took a big, what do you call this thing when you write with the soft pencil? Yeah. Then he wrote the words. The driving idea for me is sustainability. Sustainability, that's what we had talked about in the halls of the United Nations. And I promised him that I would go back to the United Nations and quote him and see this is a kid who creates jobs for himself and 10 others, and the driving idea is sustainability. I don't know whether this is but I couldn't really. You are probably right. What are you thinking about yourself, Nick? I mean, you are the one asking us questions, but have you seen it? What I like about your articles and your writing is that you're so hands-on, and you really get that field sense from everything you write. Have you seen it yourself?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that there is a real issue at times. Again, it's sort of what Lema describes when you get a bunch of very smart outsiders who come up with an idea around a conference room in New York or Washington and march in with megaphones and tell everybody, okay, look, we have this amazing idea, and they tell everybody what to do. And I think that that fundamentally can be disempowering.
Let me give you an example of a typical case of disempowerment. You have a group of women in a community who have been affected by violence, and you set up a space for them. They come to live in that space where they have 3 meals a day, everything good, psychosocial, new clothes, everything. And then after 9 months, you send them back into their communities who have not benefited a dime from their 9 months of good life. They go back into the community, and everyone says, hands off. We don't want to have to deal with you. So there is no social support for them anymore. Whilst this is a good idea, how can you extend what is being done by community outreach, preparing the community for these group of women coming back into the community, that they will come back, and this is the incentive to the community for their coming back, because you know they live in a space of collectivism. That's the first thing. I heard recently that with these new elections of Buhari, everyone is excited, and there's a group that's going in with some food that is already made here to distribute there. Help me understand that. How do you make eba, the typical Nigerian meal, in New York and send it back there? After you've distributed all of those meals, how do those people also begin to learn to get food? I don't know. If that is not disempowerment, then I missed the science or English class when they were discussing disempowerment.
I want to push back a little bit at one thing you said, though. On the gender issue, I completely agree with you that's a crucial lens to look through. But I think sometimes here, when we look at gender, we measure that in terms of leaders. And we think, okay, it's so important to have, who has a woman prime minister or president. And I must say that you look around the world, and it seems to me that women presidents and prime ministers haven't been great for the women in their countries.
Nick, I'm already in a lot of trouble in Liberia. Can you not ask that question?
And there is a great movement to get a woman secretary general of the
I
UN.
know, I just read that.
Yeah.
Well,
Let me ask you this more diplomatically. Would we be better off focusing our efforts on getting a critical mass of girls educated, of women village chiefs, using those kind of metrics?
I think we will be, like education for girls, fine. More grassroots leadership for women, fine. But I also will not, feminists, no if or but, I'll also not cut out the part of women leaders. I mean, let's be honest. The men have messed up for thousands of years. And if we have one or two who have messed up, does that mean we should close the door on the rest who wants to come in? No. So I think, I personally, going back to my own country, campaigned for President Sirleaf in 2005. I did it in 2011. If she was going for a third term, I won't campaign for her. But if there is another woman who is going in to run for office, I will campaign for her. Because Liberia is 161 years old, and we've had men all along. The other thing that I would say about our president, when President Sirleaf became president, because she was the first female president in Africa, and because we had had this euphoric women's movement, everyone assumed that she was a part of the women's movement, which was a wrong assumption. President Sirleaf has been a politician from day one. She's a politician today. He doesn't understand the language of feminism, women's movement, or women's activism. She is a politician inside out. So it was our role to kind of work with her to get her there. Instead, we fought. There was always this clash of values and principles, and it brought us to a place where we haven't seen it. Maybe we need to do our work a little bit better and maybe work with the female politicians to do their work a little bit better, but I won't shut the door. If there's a woman running for president in this country, I will also be telling people that I know vote for that woman because the men have done it long enough. It's about time that you all have a female president.
And now, Lema, you're in even more trouble in Liberia, I'm afraid. But
yeah. No, but I think one great thing is the move to get women into power in parliaments and in governments. In my country, you have to have 50% women have become a tradition. 50-50 since about 20 years in Sweden, Norway, possibly Denmark. But still it's going too slow. Only 22% of the parliamentarians of the world are women. It's actually Rwanda and Sweden who are the lead, 46, 48, something like that. But I think we need to see more women in peace mediation work. I've been mediating in 6 different conflicts. Slightly masochistic pleasure. I've never faced a woman on the other side. Never. Iran, Iraq, Darfur, well, I can name them all. Never a woman on the other side. So this resolution that Lema mentioned, the 1325, to have women in to really bring in the realities of what war means is so crucial. You played an important role in ending the war in Liberia. I have always had women at my side. Very nice time. But the fact that we had to force in Darfur the government and the opposition to accept that we brought in women observers. We brought 25 women observers from Darfur and Khartoum to the negotiations. And it was not well regarded at all. What are you doing? You're not accepting our cultural habits here. So it's an interesting, you feel that you have something very important to stand for, the universality of values, you think, but still you run into a cultural resistance.
Let me ask a kind of different kind of question. Philanthropy is often focused on wanting to deliver services at a practical level. What about advocacy instead? Should philanthropy think about, that in some cases it's going to get more bang for the buck, more leverage from advocacy than from traditional delivery of services? Well,
I think advocacy is I touched upon that in my comments earlier, that what you can do to influence Congress, you, is absolutely crucial. And sometimes I ask myself whether that is not even more important. Of course, it's important then that you choose a subject for advocacy which is really very good. But if you can push that so that we have an understanding that this is the way to do in our own enlightened self-interest. I claim, I don't know whether you call me idealistic or not, Lema, but I claim that in today's world, a good international solution, a good formula for dealing with a global issue, like migration, like climate, whatever, a good international solution is in every nation's national interest. Think about that. Can you imagine that we come to that stage that, yes, we've got to have an international solution, otherwise we are not accepting, understanding our own national interests. I also claim the other way around. For us who work with international issues, we also must understand that what is being done at home to create a good society for our own citizens, for peace, development, and human rights, is the best contribution you can make, not only for the life of people in those countries, but also for regional and international security. Because failed states turn into civil wars and regional conflicts. So, in a strange way, an interesting way, the borderline between international and national is disappearing. That is, I think we should pick up. And therefore, whatever you can do to increase this awareness of the world outside, the fact that I was honored to give the speech on National Day, which is a huge thing in Sweden. Pim, you're here. Big thing. My Swedish assistant. And I had a very simple line. I said, Sweden is part of the world. But then I added, but the world is also part of Sweden. You've got to understand that Sweden is part of the world, but if you don't understand that the world in today's world is also part of our own country, then we are on the absolutely wrong track. So I think advocacy for making our own societies better, but at the same time seeing how we belong together and how, when things go wrong far away in the world, it will hit us. It doesn't require an epidemic for us to be sticking together. So I think that sort of basic framework, I think, gives me a reason to believe in this organization that I represent, even if it needs to be improved.
Well, you're both America watchers as well, and do you worry that to some degree the U.S. is retreating from the world? That U.S. public opinion has looked around and there's kind of an exhaustion with conflicts around the world, with need around the world. There's a lot of emphasis on nation building at home. Do you worry that maybe the only thing worse than the U.S. trying to make the world a better place is the U.S. not trying to make the world a better place?
Well, I think the U.S. is at a place where they're trying to find themselves again, and I think they obviously are exhausted with the global conflict because they have a lot on their own plate. But I also think the entire conversation he talked about human rights is something that is totally missing from the equation in this country. I think when you look at, it's easier for the U.S. to talk about human rights from the outside perspective, looking at outsiders. And when it comes to this country, it is neat and neatly packaged in civil rights. No one wants to talk about human rights here. So the way to avoid the human rights conversation, and it makes them look bad globally, is to begin to talk about civil rights. So even when there is a clear human rights violation, the conversation is turned neatly around to begin to focus on issues of civil rights and civil violation and all of those different things. But I think there's a lot to do here, and I think it's time that there is a recognition from this part of the world that we need to focus inward a little bit and stop policing the rest of the world. And this kind of politics of contradiction is really driving some of the thinking of the young people in this country. Having spent a lot of my time at different universities here, you get to see young people Really, and that's the culture of, I'm trying to take something away from my conscience by doing something outside. So you go to places like Philadelphia where homelessness is at its peak. And then you have students at an Ivy League school telling you, we just came back from Rwanda from building homes for homeless people. And my question is, are you kidding me? Do you live in Philadelphia? Have you walked the streets of Philly lately? You know, so I think not only is it, I don't think there's an exhaustion with the world. I think there's a lot of hypocrisy, if we must call it that, you know, looking at the world and not looking inwards. And I think that kind of politics of hypocrisy is being passed on a lot to the young people. There's a lot of good that can be done because the enthusiasm of the young people in this country to make global change, to make national change is there. But I think people need to begin to speak the right language about what is really happening at home in this country.
I was an exchange student in the United States, 17-year-old. I graduated from Decatur High School, Indiana, close to Fort Wayne, a long time ago. And I was the most exotic person anyone could imagine. It was just incredible. It was like I came from another planet, the kind of questions I got. But I then came back to Washington. I was first secretary during the Vietnam War and Watergate. I came back as ambassador in Washington during the Iraq War, 9/11. I think that any society, and this goes for the American society and European societies also, that chooses to look inward may create a sense of comfort and security. But I think the vitality of your society is going to depend to what degree you adopt the United States in the world and the world in the United States. You have a great tradition in your country, the whole immigration. Quarter of the Swedish population immigrated to Minnesota and Wisconsin, you know. And when I wanted to strengthen my self-confidence as ambassador, I went to Minnesota and Chicago, Wisconsin. And I think that was what gave you the status in the world, that you received the people from around the world. And I hope that these trends that you have, and that European nations have even more, I would say, of looking inward and looking at the outside as a problem, that we have to have a very good and open discussion about how important it is that it is being done, not only for goodness or UN principles, but for the simple reason that this is the best thing for society. I think those societies who decide to look inward and not take in the world, they will be, in 20, 30 years old, much less vital and bouncing on the world scene and internally also. Maybe it's a little bit idealistic. Thank you. Thank you for that.
So, if you were to come across that $1 billion or a few $1 billion, I'm curious about where you would find, each of you would find it would have the greatest impact. What would you do philanthropically, either of you?
Don't let me dream. First thing first, coming to $1 billion, I would dance for a week. Because I can just imagine all of the tiny but really substantive projects that I could put it into. You know, I would focus on girls' education, first and foremost. I'll focus on maternal health issue, youth empowerment, especially on the continent of Africa, because we have a lot of indicators that the powder keg on our continent is the unemployed youth. That is the basis for the next crisis that Africa might see. I could do a lot. I can go on saying, but then the temptation is I will end up being like a lot of those that I just talked about, too many focus and not doing any specific thing. But in all honesty, my fish and chips will be women's empowerment, because that's where I think a lot of what we need, the world needs a lot, but I also think that it would change the dynamics of the politics locally and globally if you had a lot of women empowered, educational-wise.
Yeah, I would agree. A girl a girl, a teacher, a book, a pen can change the world. Malala, 12th of July, 2013. Fantastic speech. I would not fall in that trap either, have a wish list, but I'm really almost obsessed by the water and sanitation issues. It's absolutely crucial. You know, I've introduced in the diplomatic vocabulary toilets for some time, and my latest innovation in the General Assembly Hall is open defecation. 1.1 billion people practice that. And I would see sanitation as absolutely crucial in connection with waste management. We have, it's an interesting number here, we have 6 billion mobile cell phones in the world, and subscriptions, and we have 4.5 billion toilets. Make that... of course, this is a great addition. These 6 billion cell phones, they are changing the world, even on the grassroots level. But the fact that 2.5 billion people don't have sanitation, 748 million people don't have safe drinking water. This is a dream. A dream to have that. 1,000 children, it was 2,000 10 years ago, 1,000 children under the age of 5 die out of diarrhea, dysentery, dehydration. I've seen them die in front of me. And that's an absolute disgrace and shame. And so I would put a lot of money in that.
DSG, you talk about this being a dream. As a refugee, almost 25 years ago, this was the bathwater on the refugee camp in Ghana. For each and every one of us, one sachet, you decide what you would do with it.
And so, Lema, when you spend your $1 billion on girls' education, empowerment, this kind of thing, it sounds like you would spend it not on forming some new international NGO, but more like a venture capital fund supporting local grassroots organizations.
Exactly.
With no metrics.
Metrics will not be the basis of the work that I do. You need it obviously to say this, but that will not be the foundation of everything. If you can't do it, if you don't do it, you can't get into this. And sometimes I think where we are, if we're just too straitjacket about everything we do and leave out creativity in the work that we do, we may end up not getting what we want to get done. When we did the mass action, there was no budget, there was nothing. We thought on our feet, and at the end of the day, we're able to get the results that we got. The world is not, just one way. You have to be able to be creative and think through. And sometimes I think people should just say, let me just give to this cause because I believe in it, and not look for metrics at the end of the day because obviously, thank you. We're running low on time, but Jan, let me press you likewise on your investments in sanitation, girls' education too. Is there a risk that we're letting governments off the hook if whether it's international agencies or whether it's private philanthropy, are funding things that government sometimes should be doing, rather than holding them accountable for providing services?
The best meeting I've attended on water and sanitation was 3 years ago in the World Bank, where fortunately I and Tony Lake, UNICEF, and a woman called Rachel Kite in the World Bank were asked to present the issue in front of 50 ministers of finance. And we were very tough, almost as tough as Lema is here tonight, with these finance ministers saying that we can't build this on charity or philanthropy. You've got to do it yourself also. If you calculate what this means, this lack of sanitation, clean water means for you in terms of health, employment, productivity, just life and dignity. But you can even calculate in metrics that, yes, this is bad. It's bad for you not to do this. Believe it or not, we did a survey a year afterwards, no, 2 years afterwards. Out of these 48, I think they were, Minister of Finance, 12 had increased the budget, the allocation for sanitation. Maybe partly due to our conference. So yes, You have to have a dynamics. We have to expect also measures to be taken on the ground. That's why I'm a fighter for strong institutions, fighting corruption, and make sure that, yes, there has to be a delivery. You have to have partners that help you really make sure that it happens.
But I think, just in line with what he's saying, I think it's also important for some of the groups that are putting money into it to really begin to be hard on government and tell them when they are not doing the right thing. You can't be political about your associations. On our continent, most of our governments are very irresponsible and unresponsive to the needs of the people. But when you go in and befriend these governments and do everything that they are supposed to be doing, whilst you've never, ever said anything to them, it continues. It gives reason for them to think that I think it's time for them, if you are having Rockefeller, whatever, having these big meetings, stop giving honors and awards to those presidents that are not providing the basic needs of their people, because then you are reinforcing their attitude of not being good to their citizens. Don't invite them to your dinners. If you have to be giving water, clean water and sanitation to their people, don't give them any awards. Do your work, name and shame them, and maybe, just maybe, it will change.
Yeah. Well, on that theme, indeed, that's how I would spend my billion. I mean, on the same causes, but it strikes me so often that you travel in the developing world, you see schools, and there are students there, but no teachers, because the teachers are paid whether or not they show up. Or there are ghost schools that exist on paper, but the Minister of Education has pocketed the money. I was in Angola earlier this year, you know, the single country in the world with the highest child mortality rate in the world. And also one of the richer countries in Africa. The president's daughter is a billionaire. Half the population gets no health care. I do think that in cases like that, our leverage comes from naming and shaming, as you say, from accountability, and that governments and NGOs aren't very good about that because they want access. And that is a role for the philanthropic community.
High five.
With metrics, without metrics, who knows? Thank you very much, and please join me in thanking our panel today.
Well, thank you to our panelists, and thank you for all joining us here today. This is a conversation that definitely deserves to continue, and maybe there are more high fives to put out there. But while our formal annual meeting must come to an end, I invite all of you, including our speakers, to join us for a reception outside here. And as a special treat, we may not have fish and chips, but we have a gift for each of you, a copy of Nick Kristof's book, A Path Appears. And Nick will be available to briefly sign some of the copies. So as you leave out the auditorium, some Philanthropy New York staff will guide you to the reception. I hope you'll join us. Thank you again for joining us today.